Hi everyone, Kettle Run Railfan here once again with another feature-length video for you. By feature-length, I mean, I don't know, probably 25 minutes. But today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going out to CSX country, Cumberland, Maryland. I'm going to spend the day out there. We're going to chase the Western Maryland Scenic up and down the mountain and just catch whatever comes through on CSX. So hope you all enjoy. While our main intention was to spend the day up on the Cumberland subdivision in its namesake city, we actually started in Winchester because this engine had come down on a local job just the day before. CSX 2756 is an EMD GP38-2 that was built in March 1973 as Penn Central number 8148. It eventually became part of Conrail in 1976 and retained the same number up until the Conrail split in 1999 when it was sent to CSX and given its current number. This engine is a little bit more significant compared to its cousins in the GP38-2 family on CSX in that as of right now, it's the last one with CSX's famous yellow nose tube paint scheme. This engine's been well sought after by Maryland and Virginia rail fans for quite a while, so I think it's pretty lucky that I got to see it in such a perfect spot today. Our intention was to just get the pictures of the engine, then go, but we hung around because obviously we decided to look around at the rest of the equipment, including the 3 CSX engines that had towed the grain train down from Brunswick a day or two prior. But then, right as we were starting to pack up our equipment, a little surprise came around the corner. Coming down from either their own yard or the CSX interchange is the Winchester and Western Railroad's famous Sandman train, with 3 of the company's own GP38-2s pulling the train back to the Union Company sand mine in Gore. Note the GMTX leader that I believe is on long-term lease to the railroad. I'm not sure why the horn was placed in such a weird spot on the engine, but I'm also not sure what kind of horn it even is, so feel free to leave a comment if you can answer that, 'cause I'd like to know. After the Sandman cleared, we made tracks for Cumberland, and although the Frostburg flyer was already in the station, we found a surprise. We were kind of expecting the train to be double-headed, but we were pleased to see that the railroad's own 501 was getting ready to fly solo up the mountain. The 501 is an EMD GP30 that was built for the Pennsylvania Railroad in May of 1963 as their own 2249. It retained that number up until 1995 when it was sold to Western Maryland Scenic, was renumbered sometime between then and 1997 to 2131, and then renumbered in the early 2000s to its current 501 and later repainted in the striking red and white paint scheme. After getting into position and waiting for about 15 to 20 minutes, the train finally pulled out of the station around 11:30. Note how close they have to get to the crossing here in order to activate it, and the very brave drivers that were trying to cross even though the train was right there. once the train was fully out of Cumberland, the chase was on. Our first stop was at the famous Helmstedter's Curve near the town of Corriganville. Now, based on what I've seen from older photos, the location's a lot more grown up than it was back in the 90s or maybe even the early 2000s, but the railroad's currently working on making it a much better spot to shoot their trains. Initially, I wasn't sure we would even make it up here in time to shoot the train, but luck was on our side because they had a track warrant at the grade crossing just down the hill from the curve. This was due to the fact that the crossing had been out of service for some time and the crew actually had to get down from the engine and flag it. Something you don't see a lot on these big Class 1s, but nevertheless it gave us a little more time to scramble up the hill and prepare a shot. After Helmstedter's, the plan was to shoot the train from the Parkersburg Road Bridge outside Mount Savage. The only problem with that was that guardrail was a bit too high for my liking and for my tripod. So I moved down on the ground next to the Great Allegheny Passage Trail and got a pretty nice ground shot of 501 running almost wide open, pulling those cars up the hill toward Frostburg. I was told by my friend Jackson that the Dome car was the one that Amtrak originally used to own, and that the Western Maryland had bought it for use on their own trains. Interesting. So, here's an interesting little nugget. So, what I'm standing on right now is the Great Allegheny Passage Trail. But in the Western Maryland days, this used to be Track 2, that ran from Frostburg all the way down behind me to Mount Savage, where it singled up headed into Cumberland. Now, according to some research I've done, the second track here existed until at least when CSX sold this line to the city of Cumberland for the Scenic Railroad in the late 80s. But over time it was pulled out, and in some places, I'm not sure if they did it here, they relayed the ties and rail over here. I guess if the rail was better in one place than on the other track. So there's a little nugget, but we're going to Frostburg. Obviously, we didn't make it up to Frostburg in time to see the train pull into the station, but nevertheless, we did take the time to get some pictures of the old 501 next to the 1891 C&P Frostburg Depot, which serves as the northern terminus for the tourist line. After detraining the passengers, the 501 cut off from the train and headed across the street behind us to the turntable. Because the train wasn't running with an engine on each end of the train, they would have to spin the engine around in order to pull it back south. I believe they do this because of visibility issues when running long hood forward, and I think it's just a little bit easier for them to do it that way instead of running it backwards. The engine rolls onto the turntable, and once it's balanced, the spin begins. Once the move is complete, the 501 takes off down the runaround track to hook onto the other end of the train, and the turntable is spun back into a position where the control house is located on the street side of the tracks, so as to make for easier access when getting ready to spin around another engine. Since there was a layover, we left the 501 and their crew to their liberties, found a nice little nugget while walking down the hill. You're a long way from home, aren't you? And had a top-notch lunch at a local place called the Frostburg Freeze, which I would highly recommend to anyone who is chasing the Western Maryland Scenic. For the chase back down the mountain, we started at the site of the old Mount Savage interlocking. This was the southern end of that Frostburg double track I was talking about at Parkersburg Road on the way up. This site has an old Western Maryland signal bridge, the base of the old interlocking box for the southern end of the double track, and a contemporary milepost and whistle post. The 178 indicates our distance from Mount Winans in Baltimore. The train left Frostburg not long after 2 and got to us at about 2:45. I guess it should be noted here that 501 carries one of the more unique sounding RS3Ls I've heard. Obviously, having been around a lot of ex-Conrail power recently, I haven't heard much outside of the Conrail tunings, but this one was a nice change. Afterwards, we were going to head back down the mountain towards Cumberland. But right as we were leaving, I found another little nugget at the crossing. How many times are you going to see something like that nowadays? Once back in Cumberland, we set up on the Lee Street Bridge. That's Wills Creek down in the flood control area to the right, and the former City Junction in the background. CSX's Mountain Sub crosses the creek and the old Western Maryland line on a stone arch bridge as it heads down toward Kaiser, West Virginia. It was on that bridge that an empty CSX coal train surprised us. 4 GEs were doing the honors, but I never got the symbol, but honestly, that's not a complete loss. The reason why the camera keeps shifting over to the left and then faking back to the right is because I had set up my tripod in the direction of the Western Maryland train on the other side of the bridge, and none of us were expecting that coal train to show up, so not wanting to mess up the stance I already had on the other side, I just shot handheld. As the coal train was continuing its slow march around the corner at Viaduct Junction and over the bridge, the Western Maryland train rolled into sight. So I reset on the other side of the bridge and waited for them. After this, we moved back into Cumberland proper and over to the Wills Creek Bridge on the east side of the passenger station. This would be our parting shot with the 501 and its train for the day. An interesting note here is that the line from the Cumberland passenger station to Frostburg is the old Connellsville subdivision, and the line from east of the passenger station to the remnant at Ridgely and to the Y at Maryland Junction is the old west subdivision that ran to Hagerstown. You can still see the roadbed pretty well in some places east of here if you know where to go. Those two guys standing there are my brother Carter and my friend Jackson Van Ness, who decided to come along with us today. He hadn't been up to the Scenic in a while, but the information he gave us was pretty invaluable to the chase. Well, that was actually a really nice little chase we had there. Obviously, I had a couple other spots listed that I wanted to hit on this ride, but I think what we did today was more than enough. But there's one other railroad in this town that we're going to focus on, so let's do that. In that last clip, you probably heard something that sounded like air hoses separating. Well, that was because the 501 cut off from the train and ran down into Ridgely Yard for the night, and the railroad's other engine, number 450, came up and pulled the cars into the yard. This engine, which is a former Amtrak F40PH that was rebuilt at some point, was getting some work done on its sanding boxes, which is why we didn't see it on the train, and my guess is they just wanted to take it out for a spin and make sure everything worked. Also note the Polar Express paint scheme, which, in my opinion, is... well, you can probably guess what I think of it. As a quick side note, as of the time of recording, I'm not sure what the plans for 1309 are, but my guess is it's going to be out really soon. After getting our parting shots at the Scenic Railroad, we finally made it over to the Amtrak station to set up for the evening CSX activity. There was a yard shifter working with a pair of GEs, the second of which was a rebuilt AC-44 CWM. This wasn't the first time I had seen one of CSX's rebuilt AC-4400s, but at the same time I thought it was a nice little surprise to distract us from the constant other sets of GE wide cabs that often run up and down this road. While checking out the shop complex and the deadlines, a blast from the past caught us off guard. Another yard shifter came up with 2 EMD SD40-2s doing the honors. This day had really turned into a standard cab convention, but none of us were complaining because we really don't see this a lot. When we saw them initially, they had a whole train. And when we got back to the Amtrak station and they got to us, they only had that lone grain car. We weren't sure why they were doing it like that, but we figured out why a few minutes later. The crew pulled up, threw a couple switches, and shoved back into the yard track that pair of GEs had just come off of. And it was at that point that I realized the grain car was actually going to be a buffer car. You may have noticed down there under the bridge that there was a cut of auto racks and a cut of tank cars. The GEs, I believe, were attached to the tank cars, And this yard crew had brought up the buffer car to hook onto this end of the train. I'm not sure if there was a power set on the other end, but it was still pretty cool to see. In terms of the lineage of these engines, the 2432 was built in 1974 for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. It eventually became part of the Seaboard Systems roster, and eventually CSX, where it was initially numbered 8179, and served as a road engine until at least 1998, when it was renumbered to 2432 and permanently assigned to the Cumberland hump. The 8418 was built for the Chesapeake and Ohio in 1966 as an SD40 and served them up till the CSX merger happened, where it was eventually rebuilt to an SD40-2, and it retained its Yellow Nose 1 paint up until about 10 years ago. I'm not sure if it's permanently assigned to Cumberland as well, but I'll leave that up to you. The yard crew were just finishing their duties and were about to reverse into the yard when up came Q135, double-stack containers from Portsmouth, Virginia to North Baltimore, Ohio. A pair of clean GEs were doing the honors today. This train was interesting in that it had foreign containers on the head end, but once the DPU went by, it was all domestic containers. I'm not sure why this is the case, but it was kind of interesting to see this because over on Norfolk Southern, as you've probably seen, we have dedicated foreign and domestic trains, but you never usually see them together except in rare instances. Another thing to note here that this train was really long, so I just cut a lot of the footage out to save time. After Q135, we moved over to Viaduct Junction on the west end for the last train of the day. The train in question was our old friend Q217, empty auto racks from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Louisville, Kentucky, via Marion, Ohio. This train was interesting in that it had a Yellow Nose 2 AC44 doing the honors, ahead of a Yellow Nose 3 painted GE. You don't see a lot of these things leading the road trains anymore, so we thought that this train would be a pretty nice end cap to our day up here. This Q217 was just like 135 in that it was really long, and it took a really long time for it to clear the crossing over here at Viaduct Junction, partly because they were accelerating out of a crew change. We had wanted to hang on for one more coal train that was supposed to be coming out of the yard, but considering we had a 2-hour ride home ahead of us, we decided to cut it here. So yeah, that ends our little expedition to the Scenic and the CSX. I hope y'all enjoyed this, because that's the first time I've really chased the Scenic. And also that's the first time that I saw the Sandman, because I've been out to the Winchester and Western a few times, but I've never gone out there with the intention of chasing it. So that was a nice surprise when we were getting the Jeep this morning. And the Jeep was really nice too, so yeah, especially considering the circumstances surrounding that it's the last one in Illinois too. But again, I'm slowly getting around to releasing more videos because I'm finally finished with work after this weekend. I'm going to North Carolina for 2 weeks, so I'll probably crank out a couple uploads while I'm down there, so stay tuned for those. But in the meantime, go ahead and like this video if you did, and go ahead and subscribe. You should see the link to that right about now. And as always, I will see you all in the very near future.